Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and especially talking about RISC-V, because it's another innovative technology that's really kind of driving the market. At Semico, we've done some research on RISC-V over the last couple months, and I think I'm going to share some of that data with you today. We all live in a bubble that we deal with on our daily basis, but we still have to deal with the overall economics. So I thought I'd just take a couple slides to share with you where we see the market. And this is our GDP forecast for some of the different regions. And as you can see, they're all kind of trending downward. China hasn't seen we're forecasting 5.7 for next year. It's been quite some time since they've had that low of a GDP forecast. For next year in the U.S., we're below 1.9%. So not too surprising, we're seeing the overall economy slowing down. One of the things that I've looked at since my college days in economics is the yield curve. And you can see here that we're now back to an inverted yield curve where the short-term interest rates are higher than the long-term. And you can go all the way back to 1970, and every time we've seen the yield curve go below zero, within a few months to maybe 12 months, we've gone into a recession. So there's been a lot of talk about, everything's great, we're not going to go into recession next year, but I'd caution everybody to kind of take a look at this. We've been on a downward trend here. I would tend to think that, at least in our forecast, that the risk for recession in next year is greater than 50%. So with that bad news aside, let's move on to some of the brighter spots in our industry. And as I said, we looked at RISC-V from an end market perspective. We actually looked at 25 end markets and looked at the cores that were in there and looked at the potential for RISC-V going into those. And so let's talk about some of those. IoT, I think, is a great opportunity and is driving the bandwidth for the overall market. And we see a lot of edge devices, which are, over here, and a lot of those can be RISC-V architectures. One of the ones that I find very interesting is kind of my favorite one is the dairy cow. And as you all probably know, that dairy cows are not indigenous to the Sonoran Desert. But we do have a lot of dairy farms out there. So when it's 115 for 3 months of the year, dairy cows are not very happy, and their milk production goes down. So what they've done in Arizona is they built these giant shaded areas, and the cows are fitted with a cow Fitbit, and they're connected to a server, and they've got big fans set around the shaded areas with misting systems. So the farm is connected to the internet. It looks at the weather, the temperature, the wind speed, the humidity. They also keep track of the cow's respiration, their heart rate, how they're feeling, what they're eating, and all that is put into the local server, and it calculates how fast this fan should run, how much pressure should be put into this misting systems, and you end up with happy cows, and happy cows have happy milk, and happy milk is good for the farmers. So what's really interesting is we think of agriculture as being low tech and back in the 50s, but actually agriculture is very high tech. And I don't know if anybody saw the 60 Minutes last week where they had the CEO of Land O'Lakes, which is really a co-op, and they are totally into high tech. They use satellite imagery and AI to look at where and how to plant the crops that they feed the cows, and how what the pesticides is and what the soil has, so they put just the right amount of nutrition in the soil to get the optimal yield. So we're seeing that, and of course you have automotive and science and smart cities and construction, and that's all going to build into that 50 billion connected devices that we're looking at. Other areas where we see a lot of good opportunity is in vision systems. Automotive is a great opportunity, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And when you look at industrial IoT, smart factory floor operations, as well as medical, and infrastructure and security is a big opportunity here for RISC-V. Of course, there are still some of the traditional markets, which we've included some penetration rate into that, but it's probably the lowest, and I'll show you some numbers here later on. But our forecast for desktop still going down 7% this year. Notebooks, its first year, it's been up in several years, but still a mature market. And the overall cell phone market is down 1% at 2 billion units. The high-end market is going to be down this year, but what's kind of keeping it up is the mid-range, the low-end smartphones, which is still growing at about 10%. Other areas that we researched is looking at the server market, particularly server farms, and about 90% of the world's information has been developed in the last few years, and that the demand for storage and bandwidth continues to explode, and we see that market growing. Automotive, which I've just mentioned, and one of the new areas, smart speakers, and that's another area where AI is driving the market. That'll be an 83 million unit market this year, and all of this is surrounded by artificial intelligence, which I think is a great opportunity. Electric vehicles and driver assist systems is growing well. This is the 2019 electric car vehicle sales by model. It's about half of the market. If we look at Europe, they still are the largest market per capita for electric vehicles. And in China, they're about twice the size they are of the U.S. So it's still a small percentage of the overall market, about 1.5%, but growing rapidly. Last year, electric cars grew almost 82%. This year, it's slowed down quite a bit, still in the double digit. I got this from Cadence, and this is based off of their 10 silica IP, but we could easily replace that with RISC-V. But I just wanted to share that with you in terms of where the market is seeing AI going into the automotive space. And there's a lot of interest with almost all semiconductor manufacturers, as well as the ecosystem for the automotive space. And the reason why is, as you can see here, the blue line is driver assist systems, and we see that rapidly growing over the next several years to where it's almost going to be the largest segment in the market. And we're seeing a lot of new designs, new architectures going into those systems. So it's a great opportunity for RISC-V to gain some momentum. We mentioned AI as rapidly growing, and I wanted to just compare AI to micrologic. So micrologic, for our definition, is microprocessors, microcontrollers, and DSPs. By 2022, we think that the AI semiconductor dollar value will be about half the size of the overall micrologic market. And then to kind of round out the overall market sizing, this is our forecast for the semiconductor industry by the major categories. The largest one, not too surprisingly, is the black bar, which is memory. It's going into a downturn this year. But where RISC-V fits would be in the micro logic area, microprocessors, microcontrollers, micrologic, which is where we find most of our SoCs. So if we add the micro logic and the microprocessor market together, this year that's going to be a $172 billion market and about 87 billion units. Next year we think that's going to grow to $182 billion and 96 billion units. And by 2023, it will be $208 billion and 117 billion units. There's a lot of opportunity for the market, and particularly RISC-V. And so, what do we see as the potential? So first, let's go through some mythbusters. So when I first started looking at this and thinking about it, I thought, well, RISC-V is only good for the low end. It's a new architecture, but that's actually a myth after surveying the industry and talking to a number of people. We thought that it was hard to integrate into an SoC, and again, another myth that we've discovered. And it takes longer to design with RISC-V architecture than other architectures out there. And, that's a myth too. What we were shared with here this morning is that the ecosystem is maturing and is rapidly expanding, and that is a fact. We also see that market demand is growing for an open source IP, another fact. And it offers a viable alternative to ARM, which is also a fact. And I think it's interesting that in the past, Tensilica, ARC, MIPS offered customers to allow them to add to the instruction set or change it. But ARM has resisted that for many years. And I think it was last week they just announced on a couple of their product lines, and firmly believe it's as a result of RISC-V and the interest that they're getting, and they actually did have to respond to that. I think that's a good sign for the industry, a good sign for RISC-V. So we actually went out and surveyed the industry and asked companies, what are you designing and how many cores are you integrating into your designs? And 36% of the respondents were saying their designs were 1 to 4 cores. Another 29% said 5 to 8. So when you look at it in total, companies that are designing 1 to 8 cores represent 65% of the designs. But I was surprised that we had, a fair number of companies that were over 33 cores and actually had some that were up in 1,000 cores. Kind of opened my eyes of the capabilities of RISC-V and not just being in the lower mid-range part of the market. So we actually looked at about 25 different end applications and looked at the number of cores out there, gave a penetration rate to RISC-V. We thought we were fairly conservative. It's a new architecture. And really it goes from basically about 0 by 2025. We see about 42 billion cores being consumed by RISC-V, and it's broken out into these different end applications. Kind of one of the largest one is in the industrial area. That would be smart cities, industrial IoT, infrastructure, vision systems. So if we compare it to the overall industry, and this is all cores for all applications, in 2019, the total industry is consuming around 573 billion cores. That's going to grow to almost 1 trillion by 2025, 936 for the overall industry. Now, I plotted this on a different scale. It's 10x over here for the industry. But by 2025, we believe that the RISC-V could achieve 42 billion cores being consumed by the industry. And that will represent about 4.5% of the overall industry's cores consumed by all applications in all industries. So I think it's a great opportunity. I think there's probably an upside to it if things go well. So one of the things to kind of summarize the data that we collected, we looked at a 5-year compound annual growth rate, and we looked at three or four products: advanced multi-core SoCs, value core SoCs, basic, and then FPGAs. And you can see the compound annual growth rate for the highest one is in the communications area, growing at 401 compound annual growth rate. Second is transportation, and then third is the industrial market. Kind of the traditional markets, desktops, notebooks, tablets, servers is at the lowest, just under 100% compound annual growth rate. Probably most of this growth here is in the server area. And then what we included is in other categories. So these were products that were not actually specifically researched but they cut across all applications, and we included some for new applications that we didn't think of. And that really has a pretty good growth rate over the next 5 years in a total of 172%. So it's an exciting area to be in. I think in general we've gone from the industry being driven by the computer industry, then going into the mobile space. But as we look out in the next 5 to 10 years, it's really going to be driven by artificial intelligence, automotive, smart cities, industrial IoT, and building out the market so that we can get to that 50+ billion edge devices that we're looking at. And with that, I thank you.